If you grew up black in the 70s or 80s, chances are your love for a certain kind of chrome didn't start last year. It started with a sound you probably haven't thought about in a long time. The low rumble of an engine turning over on a Saturday morning while the block was still half asleep. Maybe it's the smell of Armor All on vinyl seats, or the particular blue-gray haze of a man leaning under a hood with a rag over his shoulder. He'd mutter to himself like the car could hear him and needed convincing. Maybe it's your father's hands, permanently stained at the knuckles, no matter how hard he scrubbed before Sunday dinner. That smell followed him into the house, and somehow it never felt dirty. It felt like proof of something. Today, we're talking about why so many black Gen X men still hold on to those old cars, the Buicks, the Cadillacs, the Impalas, the ones with too many payments left and not enough garage space, and why letting go of one sometimes feels like losing a piece of a father or a piece of yourself. Dig a little deeper into that attachment and you start to see it was never really about horsepower. It was about a very specific kind of freedom and a very specific kind of pride that this generation of men had to build for themselves. I want you to think back, just for a second, to the first time you saw a grown man wash his own car like it was a ceremony. Not a chore, but something closer to church. Bucket on one side, hose curled just right, a chamois cloth folded in fourths so it wouldn't scratch the paint, a radio balanced on the porch rail, playing something with horns in it. There was a rhythm to it that little kids picked up on without anyone teaching us. You knew not to run through the driveway while Daddy was working, because that was sacred time. And sacred time doesn't get interrupted, not for anything, not even for you. You'd sit on the curb and watch the suds slide down the hood in long ribbons, catching the sun. Somehow it felt like the whole neighborhood was watching too, even when nobody else was outside. That image, a man alone with his car, taking his time with something that was fully his, stuck with a lot of us longer than we realized. And it makes sense that it would stick, because for a lot of black men coming up in that era, a car wasn't just transportation. It was one of the only things in the world that was entirely under their control. Think about the neighborhoods, the jobs, the systems that told a man where he could live. Think about how far he could go and how much he was allowed to have. Then think about a driveway where none of that applied, where a man decided exactly how his own machine would look and sound. That's a kind of ownership that goes deeper than the title in the glove box. It's the ownership of your own image, your own effort, your own Saturday morning. Once you've tasted that kind of control, it's hard to just walk away from it, even decades later, even when the transmission is acting up and everybody's telling you to sell. I still remember one afternoon, sitting in the passenger seat of my uncle's deuce and a quarter, windows down, going nowhere in particular. He had the radio turned up just enough that you could feel the bass line in the door panel.
Every so often, somebody on the sidewalk would nod at the car. Not really at him, just at the car, like it was a friend they hadn't seen in a while. I asked him why he didn't just get something newer, something that didn't need so much fixing. He laughed in that way grown men laugh when a kid asks a question they've never had to explain before. He said, newer don't mean better, it just means different. And then he went quiet for a minute. He added that his daddy never got to own much of anything outright. In this car, every bolt of it was his. I didn't understand it then, not fully, but I understood the way he said it. That afternoon taught me a car could hold a whole family's history inside it, even a history that never made it into any photo album. That ride with my uncle always brings me back to the sound of Sunday mornings, because church and cars were never really separate things. The parking lot outside the sanctuary was its own kind of stage. Men who wore work boots all week long would show up in a suit with the car freshly detailed, tires blacked out, rims wiped down to a shine that competed with the sun itself. There was a quiet competition happening in that lot. Nobody saying it out loud, but everybody feeling it. A kind of pride on display that had nowhere else to go during the week. And after service, when everybody spilled out into the heat, the men would gather by the cars. They'd talk about engines and mileage and who'd gotten a good deal on a part. The kids ran between the rows, trying not to get yelled at for touching the paint. That parking lot pride never really left the neighborhood because it showed up again on summer evenings. A strip of cars would line up along the main street, windows down, music competing block by block. If you grew up around that, you remember the specific magic of a hot summer night. The street smelled like charcoal grills, cut grass, and somebody's cologne drifting out of an open car door. Girls would walk by in twos and threes. Men would lean against their hoods, one foot propped on the bumper. For a few hours, on that one strip of asphalt, everybody who showed up got to be exactly as important as their car made them look. It wasn't about money, not really, because plenty of those men were stretching every last dollar to keep that car running. It was about presence, about being seen exactly the way you wanted to be seen, in a world that too often decided how it was going to see you first. And that idea of being seen on your own terms threads all the way back to the barbershop, because that's where the real car talk happened. You'd sit there, waiting your turn, half listening to grown men argue about whether a 442 could really outrun a GTO, or whose cousin had the cleanest Monte Carlo in 3 counties, defended with total conviction. It never felt like small talk. It felt like storytelling, like oral history passed down between the buzz of clippers. Cars were currency in those conversations, a way for men to talk about ambition and taste and legacy. Nobody sat in that chair and said, "I want to leave something behind for my children." Not once, not ever. They just talked about restoring an engine block, piece by piece, over 2 long years. Everybody in that shop understood exactly what that really meant without needing it spelled out. It's funny how a barbershop conversation about carburetors can turn into a memory of your own front yard. But that's how it goes, because a lot of those restoration projects happened right there on the grass, under a tarp strung between 2 trees for shade, parts scattered like a puzzle in progress. You'd come home from school and find parts laid out on an old bedsheet in a very particular order.
An order only your father understood, and you knew better than to move a single one. Some of those cars sat in various states of undress for years, more skeleton than vehicle. Neighbors would tease a little, ask when it was finally going to run, but there was respect underneath the teasing, because everybody knew what it took to keep chasing something like that. Chasing it on a working man's budget and a working man's patience year after year. And that patience wasn't only about engines, because it showed up every fall too, when the weather started to turn. There was a whole ritual to getting the car ready for winter, checking the antifreeze, testing the battery, wiping down the seats one last time before the cold came in. Your mother or your grandmother might come out to the driveway with a cup of coffee, standing there just to keep him company while he worked. She wasn't fixing anything herself, but her presence was part of the ritual too, part of what made that Saturday feel complete. Those two, standing together in the cool air, talking about nothing important, while the radio played low from the open car door. That's a memory a lot of us carry without ever really examining it closely, tucked away for years. It's easy to forget how much of that quiet love story lived right there in the driveway, steady and unspoken, never needing an audience to be real. That patience, that willingness to wait years for something to be whole again, belongs to a different rhythm of life than the one we live in now. And maybe that's part of why holding on to these cars still matters so much today. There's something almost defiant about keeping a 40-year-old Cutlass running in a world that wants everything disposable. For a lot of these men, letting that car go doesn't just mean losing a possession. It means letting go of a version of themselves that believed something could be built to last, fixed instead of thrown away, loved instead of endlessly upgraded and replaced. In a life where so much else has felt uncertain or temporary, that permanence means something you can't easily put a price on. Permanence like that always circles back to the men who taught it, because nobody learns to love a car alone. Somebody has to hand that love down, usually without even meaning to do it. Maybe it was a grandfather who let you sit behind the wheel in the driveway, engine off, just so you could feel what it was like to be the one in control. Hands at 10 and 2, imagining the road ahead before you were even tall enough for the pedals. Maybe it was a father who let you hold the flashlight while he worked under the hood. He narrated every part like it was a bedtime story, slow and deliberate, never rushing through a single piece. This here's the alternator. This here's what keeps her charged. Patient in a way he wasn't always patient about other things. Those moments weren't really about mechanics at all, not underneath the surface. They were about a man finding a way to be close to his child, using an engine as the excuse when the words themselves felt too hard to say directly. That gentleness under the hood makes even more sense once you think about everything else these men were carrying. Gen X black men grew up watching their fathers navigate a world that rarely gave credit where it was due, a world that questioned their competence before they even opened their mouths to speak, a world that made success feel like something you had to fight twice as hard to prove. A car didn't lie, and it never once talked back. If you rebuilt that engine and it ran clean, the neighborhood knew it immediately. The sound of it pulling into the driveway told the whole story without a word. That's a powerful thing, to have one corner of your life where effort was undeniable, where the proof was sitting right there in the driveway, gleaming under a streetlight, impossible to argue with. I still remember one afternoon, years later, standing in my own driveway with my father. We were both staring at a car he'd finally decided to sell, after keeping it running for almost 2 decades. He didn't say much, just stood there with his hands in his pockets, quiet. I realized I'd never actually seen him look at anything quite like that before.
Not even at family photographs, not with that same steady, unguarded attention. When the buyer finally drove off, my father watched until the car turned the corner and disappeared completely. He let out a breath like he'd been holding it the whole time. Then he said, "That car got me through some things you don't even know about." He never explained what those things were, and I never asked him to. Some sentences are complete exactly as they are, without needing anything added. Standing there with him, I understood we weren't just watching a car leave the driveway, we were watching a chapter of his whole life quietly drive away, still his in every way that mattered. That kind of quiet grief, showing up around something as simple as a car sale, says a lot. It says a lot about how much emotion these men learned to fold into objects instead of words. A lot of Gen X black men came up in households where feelings weren't discussed out loud. Love showed up as action instead, fixing something, providing something, showing up on time, keeping a promise. A car became one of the few places where all of that unspoken feeling had somewhere to live, where pride and grief and hope and memory could sit quietly under a hood. Nobody had to name any of it directly for it to be understood. So when a man polishes that same car every Sunday for 30 years, he's not just maintaining a vehicle, he's tending to a whole private language of emotion that never needed translating for anyone. And maybe that's why these cars end up parked in driveways for decades, half project and half shrine, long after they've stopped being practical, long after easier options were sitting right there at the dealership. Because letting go doesn't just mean losing a machine, it means admitting something harder than that. It means admitting a certain version of manhood might be slipping further into the past every year. The kind built on Saturday mornings with a rag and a bucket in hand, on barbershop debates and church parking lots, and long summer nights out on the strip. Holding on to that car is a way of holding on to a whole way of being a man, a way this generation built with their own hands, often with very little help from anyone else. It deserves to be remembered as something more than stubbornness or simple nostalgia. It deserves to be understood as devotion, plain and simple, nothing more complicated than that. If any of this feels familiar, I'd love to hear about it, because I know I'm not alone. I know I'm not the only one who grew up watching a man love a car like family. Maybe you remember a specific car sitting in your own driveway growing up, or a specific sound it made when it finally turned over after weeks of tinkering, or a specific ride with your father, your uncle, or your grandfather you still think about. Tell me where you grew up and what generation you're truly from, right in the comments below. Tell me what the very first memory is that comes to mind when you picture that specific car, right down to the smallest detail. Some of the stories you share might end up shaping where these conversations go next. Before we go, I just want to sit with this for one more minute, if you'll let me. There's something beautiful about a love that doesn't need words to prove itself. A love that shows up instead as clean chrome in a full tank on a Saturday morning. These cars carried more than groceries and church clothes and cousins piled 3 deep and back. They carried pride that had nowhere else to go, tenderness translated into torque wrenches and wax, and a kind of permanence that felt like a promise in a world that didn't always keep its promises. So if you know a man still holding on to an old car everybody tells him to sell, maybe don't rush him toward letting it go. What he's really holding on to might be something far more valuable than the car itself. If this brought back a memory of your own, stay close, because there's another one of these conversations coming soon. Somewhere out there, another one of us is remembering a driveway just like yours, right now, at this very moment.